But anyway, I do want to go ahead and go to our next caller
For sure.
here. Let's go to Jay in India. Hey, Jay, what's going on?
Hey there. Good evening. Jay. Hey, Seamus. Hey, Dan.
Hey,
Hello.
Jay, what time is it in India right now?
It's early in the morning. It's like 6:30.
Okay.
I woke up and.
Well, thanks for calling,
so-
man. I appreciate it. What
Yeah.
what can we
No
talk to you
worries.
about today?
So, I hear and take part in a lot of discussions, and while doing that, it's usually it's a case of I have to be convinced, not have to be. I want to be convinced, and the other person is trying to convince me, and I make points. I'm trying to convince them, and I want them to be convinced. Hopefully, they want to be convinced.
Sure.
And on a scale, this is one of the things that you do to convince people, and I believe that most people do want to believe in things that are true, right? And there are two parts of this: the convincer and the person who wants to be convinced. I guess the convincing, and the argument and believing the argument. And there are different ways of putting it. And I was thinking about the best way of trying to convince someone, if you try and put it on a scale. On one end, you have your discussions and your debates. I don't know about the effectiveness of those. And on the other end, you just have straight up violence and I don't know, like chemical ways of convincing people.
Yeah.
So, and I also think that you need different ways of convincing people.
Sure.
To believe different things.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to have like a back and forth about whether you should always employ the most effective way of convincing someone of something, and that's on the part of you trying to be convinced, and from you trying to convince someone, and on the part of you trying to be convinced, what are you supposed to do while listening to the other person who is trying to convince you of something?
Yeah, man, this is like right up my alley. Like this is the reason why the show exists, is for conversations like this. How can we talk to other people and one, figure out if what we believe is true, and if so, how do we convince other people that this is true? This is an interesting thing. So one thing I think that we have to consider when we have conversations like this is, I think you hit the nail on the head. I think it's multiple methods. I don't think there's one single method. So check this out. The two calls that we just had, you know, we talked about conspiracy theories here. What's going to convince those people clearly is not what's going to convince me, right? And probably vice versa. So if there's some sort of other pattern-seeking behaviors like Seamus was talking about, maybe that we could show some different kinds of patterns that could give a more full explanation for the questions they might have of why they think the way things are. You know, maybe that might be more convincing for them. There are some people who really like the debate format, but the common person I find, you know, doesn't really get a lot out of it if they're getting debates out of it. Because one, I mean, debate really is an art form. It really is something you can study. But two, if people don't feel like they have the best explanation for something at the time, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to surrender their beliefs right then and there. You know, I think it usually takes a bit more digging. I can speak to this myself. When I first had a conversation with Anthony Magnabosco a few years ago, I didn't become an atheist right then and there, right? But like what he was saying was really making sense. And he was asking me a lot of great questions that really kind of led me down a path of thinking. Now, questions I was already considering at the time, mind you, but he definitely put it into perspective in ways that I might not have considered had he not framed it in a particular way. So we have to think about where the other person is coming from and maybe craft arguments or maybe craft points that is going to work within the framework of someone. Now, for example, like I know there's studies about this, about convincing people of different things based on political views. And like one of the ways that people convince these sort of right-leaning people about LGBTQ rights was that, well, LGBT people are Americans, and some of them fight in this country for us every day, and they should be afforded the same privileges and rights that the rest of us Americans have when it comes to like marriage equality and things like that. So like it was found that arguments like that were much more effective than what we might consider typical to our kind of rhetoric. That's not really an argument that you hear too much when you talk about LGBT stuff, but it does fit into a lot of cultural ties that someone who is right-leaning might identify with. So taking account of background information is important for that too. Seamus, I'm sure you have some thoughts about this.
Well, I think the first thing that we have to consider is that whenever you're engaging with somebody, if the end goal is to absolutely convince them that you're right and you're wrong, sometimes that's not the right way to go because you're not always going to get there. But and the format is also important. I mean, if you're doing this on social media, good luck. You know what I mean? Because that could last forever, right? Because everyone wants has the last word. Everybody wants to jump in, but definitely engaging. I think in the Socratic method, whenever you're speaking to somebody is important. But also, like what Dan just mentioned about how Anthony got you to think about different things, right? Planting those seeds are really important, right? Yeah. You don't have to convince them right then and there.
Oh, for sure.
If you could at least get somebody to think about something, or to at least approach things, differently. I mean, whenever it comes to religion, was it John Loftus does what the arguments for your faith versus the others kind of thing, and I think that's brilliant. It's always good to steel man arguments too, right? Instead of straw manning them.
Yes,
I think those kinds of things are what to look at. And again, just as long as you are getting your point across without BS, okay? Just put it out there, being honest, and trying to approach the other person as just a person. I think that's the other thing. People often get into demeaning conversations because you're on the right or you're on the left, then you are, somehow inferior or unintelligent, and right then it's just discourse is over. So
yes,
that's the other.
I just
it should be obvious, but
go for it, Jay.
I just wanted to bring up that you could sit and convince everyone, which is ideally what a lot of people, not ideally, it's what a lot of people do. But then whether it comes into convincing someone as a profession, or if it's just on a debate, you're still investing time in convincing someone of something. And ideally, you want as many people convinced about your position as possible.
Sure.
Regardless of what it is. So I was wondering if employing the most effective way of convincing someone is the best thing to do. Maybe you just touch upon a certain topic and let it go there and just plant the seed in everyone's mind. So you save a lot of time instead of going all the way to the logical conclusion of every discussion. Or you try to convince them of something much larger than the topic that you're discussing about, and you just slip in your agenda.
Yeah.
And they just, as a matter of distraction, they're thinking about the larger picture, and now this is something that they just believe.
Yeah. Well, yeah, for sure. We have to consider people's doxastic openness at the time, right? Their openness to new ideas and understanding. There's a reason why young people, college-age people, switch religions and go on crazy drug benders and stuff, because they're the most open to that stuff. They're at a point in time where they're young enough to still accept new information. They're still changing in their identities and stuff. And so you're going to find that you're going to find an easier time convincing those kinds of people than, say, someone who's 60 years old who has lived a long life and has come to strong conclusions about the things that they do. So there's that thing to consider as well. Whether or not, that's an interesting question. What approach should we do? I mean, I think we kind of touched on this, but I'm not sure if there's one right answer to a question like that. Certainly, I think the best we can do most of the time is planting seeds. I actually think if I had one criticism of, the skeptic movement as a whole and how people approach ideas, I think people try to just change people's minds in one setting too much. I think I think people try to get everything out there. It's one thing to drop a God belief. It's another thing to drop a belief in all religions, and a belief in the historical accuracies of a book, and the belief, beliefs are complicated. They have a lot of structures to them that you can't just tackle in a day, especially with complex beliefs like religious beliefs. Now, some people, their beliefs aren't as complex. So if you just talk about one or two things, you're going to see a quicker change. But, a lot of people's beliefs really aren't like that. They're kind of based on other foundations, which are based on other foundations. And so, yeah, there's not one hypodermic needle you can just stick into every single conversation, which is a good thing, I think. I wouldn't want to live in a world where somebody could just, have this one amazing argument to convince me of anything. So
right. And then knowing that there are different techniques, I'll just call it techniques, but it might just come naturally to you. Yeah. But knowing that there are these different techniques of convincing, now the person who's trying to be convinced has to be aware of what's being applied on them. And this is where the whole skeptical part of it comes into play. Mm-hmm. You don't let things go unchallenged. You constantly question everything that you believe. That is also equally important in this. If the goal is eventually coming to the truth, or else it's just going to be the case that everyone's just going to believe anything, right? You can clearly convince people of anything.
And that's hard to do.
See that.
It's hard to do to be skeptical of your own beliefs,
Yes.
There's probably some beliefs that I have that aren't true. And one day somebody's going to have a conversation with me, or I'll have a couple conversations, and I'm going to figure out, these beliefs I have aren't true. I look forward to that day. But that wasn't an ethic that I personally had a few years ago. It wasn't something I necessarily look forward to. To be honest, I didn't really think about it too much. But I think we as skeptics, we tend to champion that a little bit. We really like having those kinds of discussions, even if it can get kind of heated sometimes. But yeah, Seamus, what do you think about this?
I also, whenever you're saying to different kinds of beliefs, it makes a huge difference if you're a fundamentalist, right?
Sure.
If you throw out just a couple, typical skeptical tropes, so to speak, you're not going to get somebody to change that overnight. But you just might get someone to think about it if you approach it in the correct way. But again, cognitive dissonance plays a huge role in a lot of this. I know myself personally, going to college, I was very much a believer then. And actually, when I came across the term cognitive,
when I saw her
dissonance,
face, now I'm a believer.
Yeah. So
that's
cognitive.
That's a Shrek joke I just made. They're booing me in the other room. I can hear them. I'm just going to stop. So
I was actually offended by the term cognitive dissonance as a Christian but isn't that, should that have been a light bulb moment, because the idea that you might believe, they're trying to brainwash me into being an atheist. Exactly, craziness.
Yeah. Because Christians, they treat atheism as an identity like they treat Christianity like an identity.
Yep, it's all a huge amount of projection.
Yeah, and that's something we don't always address. You can be the logical conclusions could be sound, but you have to deconstruct that social element to it too. That is really hard and isolating. At least it was for me. Where the location I was at, and that's a big reason why people don't go all the way, because there's nothing in their environment that's stimulating them through that path. If anything, their environment is wanting them to keeping themselves in that bubble because they're safer in that bubble when they're not challenging the norm. So, yeah.
And then you have something that's all the way on the so all this while we're somewhere on the milder spectrum of things, right? And trying to get someone to believe you. Then you have all the way on the other end, starting from something milder, like someone just injecting you with something and then convincing you of things, all the way to someone straight up saying no is not an answer. Regardless of how they employ that. Yeah. And that spectrum is, I think, personally speaking, the most effective. I don't know if you want to employ it on this discussion of the most effective way to convince people. Not getting no for an answer, I think, is obviously the most effective way. Yeah. Because they're just going to do it. Sure. But might not necessarily be something that you want to employ, but a lot of people do employ it.
The Socratic method is my preferred method of choice. Now, I understand when I have conversations with people here, especially with the ones that we sometimes have today, I don't expect them to change their mind after a single conversation. That's never and they may not need to change their minds. They may be right about things. But I have had, on the occasion, people call back and people email me and say, hey, I'm glad we had this conversation because I changed my mind on this. You know, that's happened to me a few times on here, and that's a really satisfying feeling to have. And I think it's because I've chosen to employ the methods of the Socratic method in some form or another. I don't know if what you can call what I do right now street epistemology, because simultaneously I'm hosting a show and I'm having a co-host talk, and you know, it's a little bit different from what other practitioners might have called it. But I do something like it. And like, to me, that's been pretty dang helpful in some conversations I've had, both on air and off air, as well as, I mean, I can speak to my own personal life. And you know, obviously I'm biased because it worked on me, but I've seen it happen. It works with people. Is it the most effective method? I don't know, but from my experience, it's works better than anything else I've tried. I don't know, maybe Seamus has any other ways or knows of anything else, but
I think that's honestly the best way to go, to be direct. I mean, but again, I mean, it depends upon what you use as a communication device too.
yes,
I mean, if you're just doing a straight up conversation, again, be clear, be honest. Again, I'm on board with you. The Socratic method, definitely the best way to go. But I mean, if you're a storyteller or a musician or something like that,
dude, narratives.
I mean, there are some really great films that if you're talking about the argument against free will, okay, just to throw this one out there, because I'm talking to my co-host John Hamill is big into free will, as in he's a determinist and doesn't believe in it. So the movie Ex Machina, which is a fantastic film, talks about artificial intelligence and the idea of consciousness and all these fun things, but the actual subtext is determinism and free will.
Yeah.
But it's clearly there, but still the narrative of the story is so good that it's not real. You know what I mean? It's going, you know, you're eternally questioning this while enjoying a great film. Mm-hmm. So, you know, those are fun ways of doing it if you're talented enough to pull that off as well. Now, again, I know some of this sounds like gaslighting, right? Yeah. That's not the same thing. You know, I think if you're honest and you're clear with your messages at the same time, then I think that's the most important thing.
Guys, putting things into narratives, that's a huge, big deal. You can change a lot of people's minds with that. There's a lot of science that backs this up. One day I would love to bring an expert in on some of the science behind communication. I do have a background in communication studies, but I'd love to have other people who also study this stuff and see, you know, like what else we can talk about, because I mean, this is such a big deal. People have been studying this for a long time, of how to change people's minds, because I mean, that's one of the most important things we can do, is change people's minds sometimes, right? Especially if you have an ethic of, look, like if we need to save the planet, you know, like we got to change the people's minds before we can do that. Or if you have an ethic about abortion, or if you have an ethic about, you know, all kinds of issues, you got to know what works best with people. And it is amazing how many people suck at that. Just really hard, because they don't look into like what makes it good. So anyway, it's a great topic to discuss, Jay. I'm really glad you got to bring it up with us. Was there anything else you want to say before we kind of wrap up this call?
Not much. That was just about it. There are a lot of aspects to this discussion of convincing people, and it could last ages. But I think we hit most of the things that I was interested in discussing, and you guys obviously brought up some things that you were interested in discussing. Thank you for your time.
Absolutely. No problem, Jay. Thank you again for calling in all the way from India.